An FBI team leader, held at gunpoint by a racist police officer, fought back, and the officer ended up behind bars. It sounds like something out of a movie, but this shocking event unfolded in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Imagine standing on your own property, unarmed, only to have your life threatened by the very person sworn to protect it. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment like this one, where power was abused and injustice stared you in the face? Share your thoughts or your story in the comments below. And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the inspiring stories we have lined up for you. Mark Lewis, a 45-year-old black man and the head of an FBI investigative team, pulled his car into the driveway of his new home. He paused for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, and took in the sight before him. The house, nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, stood proud with its white picket fence and a meticulously manicured yard. It was the type of house he had dreamed about during his relentless years of chasing criminals and navigating bureaucratic mazes. Here, he thought, he would find peace. Stepping out of the car, Mark felt a brief wave of pride and relief. He had earned this, a serene home in a neighborhood renowned for its safety and luxury. But as he unloaded his belongings, he noticed something peculiar. Curtains shifted in windows and shadows flitted behind them. Eyes were on him, cautious and probing. A sense of unease crept into his thoughts, but he brushed it off. This was a new beginning, and he wasn't going to let paranoia taint it. The next morning, Mark sat on the wooden bench in his front yard, a mug of steaming coffee in his hands. He watched the soft sunlight glint off the neatly trimmed hedges and felt a rare calm settle over him. This was exactly what he needed, a space to recharge after years of chaos. However, the tranquility was soon interrupted by the hum of a car engine. A white and blue police cruiser slowly passed by, the officer inside giving Mark a long, deliberate look. The car circled the block and drove by again, slower this time. Mark's instincts as an investigator kicked in. This wasn't a routine patrol. It was surveillance, thinly veiled as a casual drive. He remained still, meeting the officer's gaze without flinching. The officer eventually drove away, but the exchange lingered in Mark's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being sized up. As the hours passed, neighbors began to emerge from their homes, casting furtive glances in his direction. Some whispered among themselves while pretending to tend to their gardens. Mark nodded politely at those who made eye contact, but none returned the gesture. Later that day, while setting up his home security system, a standard precaution he took wherever he lived, Mark caught sight of an elderly man from across the street. The man stood on his porch, arms folded, staring openly at Mark's house. It wasn't a look of welcome, it was one of scrutiny. "Can I help you with something?" Mark called out, his tone firm but neutral. The man hesitated before replying, "Just making sure everything's all right over there." "Everything's fine," Mark responded, turning back to his task. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark sat on his porch reflecting on the day. He had moved here seeking peace, but the weight of being an outsider was palpable. The whispers, the stares, the patrol car, they all hinted at something unspoken but deeply ingrained. His phone buzzed with a notification from the security cameras he had installed. The footage showed the same police cruiser driving past his house once more, headlights cutting through the darkness. Mark exhaled slowly, the familiar tightness of vigilance settling in his chest. "This is supposed to be home," he muttered to himself, his voice laced with resolve. Though he had faced hostility and danger in his career, this was different. This was personal. Mark Lewis was unloading the last of his moving boxes when the now familiar hum of the patrol car engine reached his ears. He looked up to see the same white and blue police cruiser pulling to a stop directly in front of his house. The officer inside didn't move at first. Instead, he sat there, the low rumble of the engine breaking the late afternoon silence. Mark kept his expression neutral, though his muscles tensed. He wasn't new to situations like this, being watched, judged, evaluated. He straightened up and wiped his hands on his jeans as the car door opened and the officer stepped out. "Afternoon," Mark said, keeping his tone polite but firm. The man, a stocky white officer in his early 40s, didn't respond immediately. He adjusted his belt, his hand lingering near the holster, and walked slowly toward Mark's driveway. His sharp blue eyes scanned Mark's car, his house, and finally landed on Mark himself. "You live here?" the officer asked abruptly, his tone devoid of friendliness. "Yes, I do," Mark replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Just moved in yesterday." The officer raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been a smirk. "You bought this house?" Mark nodded, his patience already wearing thin. "That's right. I'm Mark Lewis. And you are?" The officer ignored the extended hand and crossed his arms. "Jake Miller. I've been in this neighborhood for 8 years. It's a quiet place. We like to keep it that way." Mark's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Quiet is exactly what I was looking for. Jake's eyes narrowed, his scrutiny turning pointed. This area has certain standards, Mr. Lewis. People around here like things a certain way. You sure this is the right place for you? Mark's polite demeanor faltered, replaced by a steeliness that matched Jake's intensity. Mr. Miller, he said evenly, I've worked hard to get here. I have every right to live wherever I choose. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you keep it to yourself. Jake took a step closer, standing just on the edge of Mark's driveway. I'm just saying, he drawled, his voice low but laced with a quiet threat. We don't like trouble here. And new people, well, they sometimes don't fit in. Mark didn't flinch. If trouble comes, Mr. Miller, it won't be from me. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the air between them heavy with tension. Finally, Jake let out a soft chuckle, though it lacked any warmth. Don't say I didn't warn you, he said before turning on his heel and walking back to his car. Mark watched as Jake got in and drove off slowly, the car lingering just long enough to feel like a deliberate provocation. That evening, Mark stood in his living room, reviewing the footage from his security cameras. He had installed them earlier in the day, a precautionary measure that now seemed more justified than ever. The cameras had captured the entire interaction with Jake, from his arrival to his departure. Mark shook his head, his instincts as a seasoned investigator telling him this was far from over. The next day, Mark was returning from a quick grocery run when he noticed a small group of neighbors gathered near Jake's house. Jake stood at the center of the group, gesturing animatedly as he spoke. Though Mark couldn't hear the words, their occasional glances in his direction made the subject of their conversation clear. One of the neighbors, a middle-aged woman in a floral dress, frowned as she looked toward Mark's house. Jake leaned in closer to her, his body language making it obvious he was fueling whatever doubts she already had. Mark stood by his car, watching the scene unfold. He had faced hostility before, but there was something unsettling about this quiet, suburban version of it. It wasn't loud or overt, it was insidious, a slow, deliberate undermining of his right to exist in this space. As the group dispersed, Jake caught Mark's eye. He didn't look away, his expression a mix of challenge and smug satisfaction. Later that evening, as Mark sat in his study reviewing case files, a shadow crossed one of his front windows. He glanced at the security feed and saw Jake's patrol car parked just down the street. Jake was standing beside it, leaning casually against the hood as if he had every right to be there. Mark sighed, running a hand over his face. He knew exactly what Jake was doing. This wasn't about law enforcement or community safety. It was a message, a reminder that Mark was being watched, that his presence here was unwelcome. Mark closed his laptop and stepped outside onto the porch. Jake didn't move, but his eyes followed Mark's every step. Something I can help you with, officer, Mark called out, his voice carrying through the still night air. Jake smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. Just keeping an eye on things, he said, his tone light but loaded with implication. Well, I think things are fine, Mark replied. You can move along now. Jake chuckled softly, shaking his head. You've got a lot of confidence, Lewis. Let's see how long it lasts. Without waiting for a response, Jake got back into his car and drove away, his headlights cutting through the darkness. The morning air was crisp as Mark Lewis jogged along the quiet streets of the neighborhood, his earbuds in, the rhythmic sound of his feet hitting the pavement a welcome distraction. The tranquility was deceptive, and Mark knew it. He had sensed the tension simmering beneath the surface ever since his arrival, and it didn't take long for that tension to materialize again. As he turned a corner near the small park, the sight of a police cruiser parked at the curb made him slow his pace. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped Jake Miller, his uniform sharp and his expression unreadable. "Morning, Mr. Lewis," Jake called out, his tone casual but carrying an edge that set Mark on alert. Mark slowed to a stop, pulling out his earbuds. "Officer Miller," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. Jake approached, resting a hand lightly on his belt where his badge gleamed. "Out for a run, huh? That's right. Something I can help you with." Jake smirked. "Actually, yes. We've had a few reports about suspicious activity in the area. You mind showing me some ID?" Mark blinked, his pulse quickening, though his expression remained calm. "Suspicious activity? While jogging?" "It's a routine check," Jake said, the smirk never leaving his face. "You've got nothing to hide, right?" Mark reached into his pocket and produced his wallet, pulling out his driver's license. Jake took it, holding it longer than necessary, his eyes flicking between the ID and Mark. "You've got a lot of miles on that badge, huh?" Jake remarked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Something like that," Mark replied evenly. "It comes with the territory." Jake handed the license back but didn't step aside. Instead, he shifted his stance, as if deliberately blocking Mark's path. "Let me ask you something. Mr. Lewis, Jake began, his voice quieter now, almost conversational. What brings you to this neighborhood? Not exactly the usual spot for people like you. Mark stiffened, his patience wearing thin. I didn't realize where I chose to live needed your approval, officer. Jake chuckled softly, shaking his head. Relax, Lewis. Just doing my job. Mark's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of Jake's authority pressing down on him. The unspoken message clear. You don't belong here, and I'll make sure you know it. From the corner of his eye, Mark noticed movement. A few neighbors had gathered near their front lawns, their eyes fixed on the scene. Some whispered to one another, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. None of them intervened. Jake followed Mark's gaze and smirked again. Seems like everyone's watching, huh? Guess we're all just concerned about the neighborhood. Mark took a slow breath, his hands steady at his sides. If you're done, officer, I'd like to get back to my run. Jake didn't move immediately. Instead, he let the moment stretch, the silence heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, he stepped back, gesturing lazily down the road. Sure thing, Lewis. Enjoy the rest of your day. Mark nodded curtly and jogged away, his muscles coiled with tension. He could feel Jake's eyes boring into his back until he was out of sight. When Mark returned home, he wasted no time reviewing the footage from his smartwatch, which had captured the entire interaction. The subtle hostility, the deliberate delay, it was all there. He transferred the video to his laptop and saved it, a habit ingrained from years in law enforcement. Mark's phone buzzed with a notification. A text from his colleague at the FBI read, "Everything all right? You seem on edge these days." He stared at the message for a moment, considering how much to share. Finally, he typed back, "Let's just say I'm keeping my skills sharp." That afternoon, Mark stepped outside to adjust the security cameras he had installed earlier. The first encounter with Jake had prompted the move, but now he realized the setup wasn't enough. He added an additional camera facing the street, ensuring a full view of his property. While he worked, he caught sight of one of the neighbors, an older woman named Karen, standing at her window. She didn't bother hiding her curiosity, her eyes tracking his every move. Mark walked to the edge of his driveway and waved. "Something I can help you with?" Karen flinched, then quickly drew her curtains closed. Mark shook his head, muttering to himself, "Friendly place." Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the streetlights flickered on, Mark sat on his porch, sipping a glass of water. The day's events replayed in his mind, each moment sharpening his resolve. He heard the familiar hum of Jake's cruiser approaching before he saw it. The car slowed as it passed his house. Jake's gaze locked on Mark through the window. Mark stared back, unflinching. The game Jake was playing was clear intimidation under the guise of law enforcement. As the cruiser disappeared around the corner, Mark leaned back in his chair, his thoughts already racing ahead. This wasn't just about him. Jake's actions were a symptom of something bigger, something systemic. And if Jake thought Mark would back down, he was sorely mistaken. Mark Lewis was jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. It was past midnight, and the quiet of the neighborhood had been broken by the unmistakable crash. He sprang out of bed and grabbed his phone, instincts kicking in as he quickly checked the live feed from his security cameras. The footage showed a shadowy figure disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind chaos in their wake. Mark hurried downstairs, his eyes immediately landing on the broken living room window. Shards of glass littered the floor, glittering under the moonlight, streaming through the jagged opening. Outside, the wooden fence that bordered his yard had been defaced with red graffiti. The words sprayed across it were ugly, filled with hateful slurs, leaving no doubt about the intent behind the act. Mark's jaw clenched as he stood in the doorway, surveying the damage. This wasn't a random act of vandalism, it was targeted. He dialed 911, his voice calm but firm as he reported the incident. Within minutes, the distant whine of a siren grew louder, and soon the familiar sight of a police cruiser pulled up to his driveway. Mark stepped outside to meet the responding officer and felt his stomach tighten when Jake Miller emerged from the car. Jake strolled toward him, his flashlight in hand, and an expression that was equal parts boredom and amusement. "Well, well," Jake drawled as he approached, his eyes sweeping over the broken window and the fence. "Looks like someone's had a bit of excitement tonight." Mark didn't rise to the bait. "I reported an act of vandalism. I expect it to be investigated thoroughly." Jake smirked, the corner of his mouth twitching as he scanned the graffiti. "Looks pretty specific, don't you think?" he remarked, his tone laced with faux curiosity. "You're the officer on duty," Mark replied evenly. "I'm sure you have a protocol for this." Jake crouched near the fence, shining his flashlight on the garish letters. "You know," he began, his voice casual but pointed, "sometimes people do things like this themselves. You know, to get attention. Make it look like they're the victim." Mark's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're suggesting I vandalize my own home?" Jake straightened and shrugged, his expression mock innocent. I'm just saying it wouldn't be the first time someone pulled a stunt like this. Things don't just happen without a reason, Mr. Lewis. Mark stepped closer, his voice low but cutting. You've been watching me since I moved in, officer. Don't think I haven't noticed. So tell me, what reason would I have to destroy my own property? Jake held his gaze for a long moment before letting out a soft chuckle. Relax, Lewis. I'll file the report, like you want. Mark didn't respond, his eyes following Jake as he walked back to his cruiser to grab a clipboard. Jake's leisurely pace and dismissive attitude only fueled Mark's resolve. After scribbling down a few notes, Jake handed Mark a copy of the incident report. We'll, look into it, he said, his tone making it clear he had no intention of doing so. Mark studied him for a moment before responding. Don't bother, I'll handle it myself. Jake's smirk faltered, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. You're welcome to try, he said, turning back toward his car. Mark watched as the cruiser disappeared into the night, his mind racing. He had no proof that Jake was behind the attack, but the officer's behavior only strengthened his suspicions. Inside, Mark reviewed the footage from his security cameras again. The grainy image of the figure darting away wasn't clear enough to identify anyone, but it gave him something to work with. He noted the time of the incident, the direction the figure had come from, and the car parked a block away that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. Mark's phone buzzed and he saw a message from a trusted colleague at the FBI. Need backup? He hesitated before replying, Not yet, but I might soon. The next morning, Mark began repairing the damage to his home. As he worked, he noticed a few neighbors peeking out from their windows, their faces shadowed by curtains. A couple of them whispered to one another, occasionally glancing in his direction. No one approached. By noon, the graffiti was scrubbed off the fence, but the memory of it lingered. Mark knew the incident wasn't just about property damage. It was an attempt to intimidate him, to make him feel unwelcome. Later that day, he installed additional cameras, expanding the coverage to include blind spots he hadn't considered before. As he adjusted the final one, his phone buzzed with another notification. It was an alert from the neighborhood app. Someone had anonymously posted a comment that read, "Things were better before certain people moved in." Mark stared at the screen for a moment before closing the app. The hostility was no longer hidden. That evening, as Mark sat in his study reviewing case files, his thoughts kept drifting back to Jake. The officer had been watching him from the moment he arrived, and now his home had been attacked. Whether Jake was directly involved or simply enabling the behavior, Mark was certain of one thing: the situation was escalating. He leaned back in his chair, his resolve hardening. If Jake thought intimidation would drive him away, he was mistaken. The knock on Mark's door was loud and insistent, shattering the quiet evening. He glanced at the clock on the wall, 9:47 p.m. Frowning, he set down his glass of water and walked toward the front door. Peering through the peephole, he immediately recognized Jake Miller. Swaying slightly, his face flushed with what Mark knew was more than anger. Mark opened the door just enough to face the officer, his instincts on high alert. "What's going on, Officer Miller?" Jake leaned against the doorframe, his breath reeking of alcohol. "You," he slurred, jabbing a finger in Mark's direction. "You think you can come in here, play the victim, and make me look like the bad guy?" Mark kept his expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, but it's late. I suggest you go home and sleep it off." Jake pushed the door wider, stepping into the threshold. His voice dropped, venomous and unsteady. "Don't tell me what to do. You don't get to tell me anything." Mark took a slow breath, his mind racing. The man in front of him wasn't just intoxicated, he was dangerous. "Jake, you're not thinking clearly. Go home before you do something you'll regret." Jake's laugh was harsh, almost a bark. "Regret? The only thing I regret is having to deal with you." He stepped closer, and Mark instinctively moved back, giving him space while maintaining a safe distance. "Step back," Mark said firmly, his voice calm but commanding. Jake ignored him, his hand hovering near his hip. And then, without warning, he pulled out his gun, the metallic glint catching the light. He pointed it squarely at Mark's chest. The moment stretched, taut and suffocating. Mark's hands slowly rose, palms out. "Jake, put the gun down," he said evenly. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will." "You don't belong here," Jake hissed, his grip on the weapon tightening. This is my neighborhood, my town. You've been nothing but trouble since you showed up. Mark's heartbeat thundered in his ears, but he kept his composure. Years of training had prepared him for moments like this. You're a police officer, Jake. Your job is to protect people, not threaten them in their own home. Jake's jaw tightened, his eyes blazing. Don't lecture me. You think you're better than me because you've got a fancy title and a big house? You're just another outsider trying to take over what isn't yours. Mark's phone was in his pocket, and with careful, deliberate movements, he reached for it. I'm calling Rick Daniels, he said, naming the police chief. Let's see what he thinks about this. Jake's finger twitched on the trigger, but he didn't fire. Go ahead, he sneered. Call whoever you want. They won't save you. Mark dialed, keeping his voice steady. When Rick answered, Mark spoke quickly but clearly. Rick, I need you at my house. Now. Jake Miller is here, and he's armed. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then Rick's voice came through, sharp and urgent. Stay calm. I'm on my way. Mark ended the call and looked at Jake. Help is coming, Jake. You still have a chance to walk away from this. But Jake didn't lower the gun. He paced back and forth, muttering under his breath, the alcohol fueling his erratic behavior. You've ruined everything, he said, his words slurring together. This was supposed to be a good place, and now look at it. Mark held his ground, his eyes never leaving Jake's. This isn't about the neighborhood, is it? It's about you. Whatever's going on with you, Jake, you need to face it without dragging me into it. Jake stopped pacing and stared at Mark, his expression shifting from anger to something almost vulnerable. But just as quickly, the mask of rage returned. Don't pretend you understand me. I don't have to, Mark replied. What I understand is this. You're crossing a line you can't uncross. Minutes later, red and blue lights flooded the street as Rick Daniels' patrol car screeched to a stop in front of Mark's house. The police chief stepped out, his hand on his own weapon as he took in the scene. Jake! Rick barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a whip. What the hell do you think you're doing? Jake froze, the gun still in his hand. He turned slowly to face Rick, his bravado faltering. I'm keeping the peace, he stammered. By pointing a gun at an unarmed man in his own home? Rick demanded, stepping closer. Drop the weapon. Now. Jake hesitated, his grip trembling. For a moment, Mark thought he might actually refuse. But then, with a heavy sigh, Jake lowered the gun and let it fall to the ground. Rick immediately signaled to the officers arriving behind him. Secure him, he ordered. Two officers moved in, handcuffing Jake as he stood motionless, his head hanging low. Rick turned to Mark, his expression a mixture of anger and apology. Are you all right? Mark nodded, his adrenaline still coursing through him. I'm fine, but this isn't over. Rick's jaw tightened as he glanced at Jake, now being led to a squad car. No, it's not, and it won't be swept under the rug. As the patrol cars pulled away, Mark stood on his porch, his resolve hardening. Jake's actions had crossed a line, and it was clear that the situation would only escalate further if he didn't act decisively. Rick Daniels stormed into the precinct early the next morning, his expression carved with fury. The events of the previous night played on repeat in his mind. Jake Miller, a trusted officer, pointing a loaded gun at an unarmed citizen on his own property. Not just any citizen, but Mark Lewis, an FBI investigative team leader, and a man who clearly commanded respect. Rick had handled many crises in his career, but this one was different. It wasn't just about misconduct. It was about the dangerous abuse of power, fueled by personal bias, and the ripple effects it could unleash on the entire department. Rick had already made his decision the night before. Standing in Mark's driveway, watching Jake being handcuffed and placed in a squad car, he knew immediate action was required. Jake Miller, Rick had said coldly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. You are hereby suspended, effective immediately. Your weapon and badge will be confiscated, and an internal investigation will commence first thing in the morning. Jake's face had been a mixture of shock and anger. Suspended? You're kidding me, right? Rick, you know me. Rick stepped closer, his voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. What I know is that you pulled a gun on an unarmed man for no reason other than your own damned ego. You're lucky I don't arrest you on the spot. Now in his office, Rick stared out the window, his thoughts racing. He knew the fallout from this would be significant, both internally and externally. Jake wasn't just another officer, he was popular among some of his peers, especially those who shared his outdated views on who belonged in their neighborhood. There was a knock at the door. Rick turned to see Lieutenant Greg Barnes step inside, his expression hesitant. "Chief, you wanted to see me?" Rick gestured for him to sit. "Greg, I want you to handle the initial investigation into Jake's actions. Every detail, every report, every witness statement. Leave no stone unturned." Greg nodded but shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Rick, do you think suspension was the right call? Jake's got a solid record. Maybe this whole thing got blown out of proportion." Rick's eyes narrowed. Blown out of proportion? He pointed a gun at a man standing on his own property. "That's not just misconduct, it's criminal." Greg raised his hands defensively. "I'm not saying it was right. I'm just saying maybe there's more to the story. You know how these things can get twisted, especially with someone like Mark Lewis involved. The guy's an FBI big shot. Maybe he escalated things." Rick slammed his hand on the desk, the sharp sound making Greg jump. Escalated? He was defending himself from a drunk officer with a weapon. "Don't you dare spin this into something it's not." Greg hesitated, then nodded. "Understood, Chief." "Good. Get to work, and make sure this department knows I won't tolerate anyone trying to cover for Jake." That afternoon, Rick met with Mark at his home. The tension between the two men was palpable, though not hostile. Rick had known Mark by reputation, but meeting him under these circumstances was far from ideal. "Mr. Lewis," Rick began as Mark led him to the living room. "First, I want to apologize for what happened last night. Jake's actions were inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for my department's failure to uphold its duty." Mark nodded, his expression measured. "I appreciate that, Chief Daniels, but I'm not interested in apologies. I'm interested in accountability." Rick sighed, leaning forward in his chair. "You have my word that this will be handled swiftly and thoroughly. Jake has been suspended, and I have already initiated an internal investigation. I'll personally ensure that the appropriate actions are taken." Mark studied him for a moment before speaking. "I'm going to be blunt, Rick. Last night wasn't just about Jake. It's about a culture that allows someone like him to feel emboldened enough to pull a stunt like that. And if you think a suspension and an investigation will solve the problem, you're wrong." Rick frowned but didn't interrupt. "I've dealt with people like Jake before," Mark continued. "They don't act alone. They thrive in environments where their behavior is tolerated, even encouraged. If you want to fix this, you need to dig deeper than one officer's bad judgment." Rick nodded slowly. "I hear you. And you're not wrong. But understand this cleaning up a department isn't something I can do overnight." Mark leaned back, his gaze unyielding. "Then you'd better start now, because I'm not letting this get swept under the rug." After leaving Mark's house, Rick returned to the station, his resolve hardening. He called an emergency meeting with his senior staff, his tone leaving no room for debate. "This department is under a microscope," Rick began, his voice firm. "Jake Miller's actions have put us in a position where every move we make will be scrutinized, not just by the community, but by higher authorities. We either clean house now, or we lose the trust of the people we're supposed to serve." He let his words sink in before continuing. "If anyone here thinks Jake's behavior was acceptable or defensible, speak now. If you stay silent, I'll assume you're on board with the changes I'm about to make." The room was silent, but Rick could feel the undercurrent of tension. He knew not everyone supported him, but he also knew he couldn't afford to back down. "From this moment forward," Rick said, his tone final, "any officer who abuses their power will face consequences. And if I find out anyone is covering for Jake or trying to interfere with the investigation, you'll be out the door faster than you can blink." Mark Lewis sat at his desk, the soft glow of his computer monitor reflecting in his sharp, focused eyes. On the screen before him was the security footage from the night Jake Miller had stormed into his home, gun in hand, making threats that could have easily turned lethal. The footage was clear. Every word, every movement, and every expression had been captured. It was damning evidence. Mark extracted the files, ensuring they were time-stamped and unaltered. His years in the FBI had taught him how to prepare airtight evidence, and this was no exception. The video wasn't just about his own safety, it was about exposing a systemic issue. He attached the footage to an encrypted email and sent it directly to the FBI's legal division, including a detailed account of the events. Moments later, his phone buzzed. It was Sarah Fields, an attorney he trusted deeply. "I just watched the footage," Sarah said, her voice sharp with anger. "This isn't just misconduct, Mark. This is outright criminal behavior. We're going to take this up the chain immediately." Mark leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "I want everything done by the book, Sarah. No shortcuts, no loopholes. If this goes to trial, I want them to see every second of what happened." "It will," she assured him. "But you need to be ready. Once this becomes public, it's going to get messy. People will come after you, Jake's supporters, the department, even some in the community." "I've dealt with worse," Mark replied, his tone resolute. Within hours, the footage began to circulate internally within the FBI. By the next morning, Mark received a call from a senior agent. "Mark, we've got your evidence." "This is explosive," the agent said. "We're bringing in external investigators to handle this, and I'm recommending immediate suspension for Jake Miller, pending criminal charges." Mark nodded, though he knew this was only the beginning. "Do it quickly," he said, "and be prepared for pushback." As news of the footage spread, it wasn't long before local media caught wind of the story. A reporter from a regional network reached out, requesting an interview. Mark declined, choosing to let the legal system take the lead. However, the story gained traction, and soon it was impossible to contain. The headline read, "Local police officer caught on camera threatening FBI agent at gunpoint." By midday, Mark's phone was flooded with calls and messages. Some were from colleagues offering support, while others were from advocacy groups eager to use his case as a catalyst for broader discussions. One organization in particular, the Civil Rights Alliance, reached out directly. "We've seen the footage, Mr. Lewis," said Anita Patel, the group's director. "Your experience highlights a much larger issue: systemic bias within law enforcement. We'd like to work with you to bring this issue to a national platform." Mark hesitated. His goal had always been to hold Jake accountable, but Anita's words resonated with him. This wasn't just about one rogue officer. It was about a culture that allowed someone like Jake to feel untouchable. "I'll consider it," Mark replied, his tone cautious but thoughtful. By the end of the week, Mark found himself in a conference call with Anita and her team. They laid out a plan to use his case as a springboard for a larger discussion about accountability in policing. "This isn't about vilifying all officers," Anita said. "It's about rooting out the ones who abuse their power and creating a system where behavior like Jake's is never tolerated." Mark listened carefully before responding. "If we do this, it has to stay focused on the facts. No sensationalism. The footage speaks for itself." "Agreed," Anita said. "We'll let the evidence lead the conversation." While the media frenzy grew, Mark received another call, this time from Rick Daniel. "Mark," Rick began, his voice heavy with frustration, "I'm getting heat from every direction. The department's reputation is in shambles, and half my officers are furious about this investigation." "That's not my concern, Rick," Mark said bluntly. "This is about accountability. If your officers are angry, maybe they should take a hard look at why." Rick exhaled sharply. "You're not wrong, but you've got to understand, this isn't just about Jake anymore. It's about the department, the community, and the trust we're trying to rebuild." "Then fix it," Mark said firmly. "Hold your people accountable. Make it clear that behavior like Jake's won't be tolerated." Rick didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone was resigned. "You've got my support, Mark. Just know this fight won't be easy." Over the next few days, Mark watched as the community began to react. Some neighbors expressed quiet support, offering small gestures like a friendly wave or a plate of cookies left on his porch. Others, however, made their hostility known. One morning, Mark found a handwritten note in his mailbox. The words were scrawled in angry black ink. "You should have left when you had the chance." He folded the note and placed it in a file with the other evidence he was collecting. This wasn't the first threat he'd received, and he doubted it would be the last. Mark's resolve only deepened as the case gained traction. The FBI announced a formal investigation into Jake Miller's actions, and the district attorney's office confirmed that criminal charges were being considered. Meanwhile, Mark agreed to participate in a webinar hosted by the Civil Rights Alliance, where he shared his story with activists, policymakers, and community leaders. "This isn't just about me," Mark said during the discussion. "It's about every person who's been made to feel unsafe in their own home because of someone abusing their authority. We need systemic change, and it starts with accountability." The response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from across the country, but so did the criticism. Anonymous emails accused him of betraying law enforcement and stirring up trouble. Mark ignored them, focusing instead on the larger goal. The courtroom was packed, every seat occupied, and every corner buzzing with tension. Jake Miller sat at the defendant's table, his once proud demeanor reduced to quiet apprehension. His lawyer, a sharp-suited defense attorney named Robert Crane, whispered instructions to him, though Jake barely seemed to register them. Across the room, Mark Lewis sat calmly, his presence commanding attention. The trial began with the prosecutor, Linda Garvey, presenting her case. She wasted no time. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you are about to see and hear is undeniable. The defendant, Jake Miller, abused his authority as a police officer and threatened the life of an unarmed man, Mark Lewis, in his own home. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act of intimidation. Linda turned to the large screen behind her, where the security camera footage played. The room fell silent as the video unfolded. Jake stumbling into Mark's home, his voice slurred but filled with malice. The image of Jake pointing his gun at Mark was clear, as were his words, "You don't belong here." The jury's reactions were visible. Some leaned forward, frowning, while others exchanged uneasy glances. When Mark took the stand, the prosecutor guided him through his testimony. "Mr. Lewis, can you recount the events of the night in question?" Linda asked. Mark nodded, his voice steady. "Jake Miller came to my house uninvited. He was intoxicated and aggressive. When I asked him to leave, he escalated the situation, drawing his firearm and threatening me. I called the police chief immediately to de-escalate the situation." Linda nodded. "And during this confrontation, did you ever provoke Officer Miller?" "Not at all," Mark replied firmly. "I remained calm and tried to defuse the situation. My goal was to avoid violence." The defense attorney stood, adjusting his tie. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Lewis is making subjective judgments about my client's intent." The judge, a stern woman with a piercing gaze, glanced at Linda. "Sustained. Rephrase your question, Ms. Garvey." Linda shifted gears smoothly. "Mr. Lewis, did you feel threatened for your life during this encounter?" "Yes," Mark said without hesitation. "There's no other way to describe the situation when someone points a loaded weapon at you." When it was the defense's turn, Robert Crane approached the jury with practiced confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client is not a villain. Jake Miller is a man who has served this community for years. On the night in question, he acted out of character. He was under immense personal stress, compounded by intoxication. What happened was a lapse in judgment, not a premeditated crime." Crane gestured toward Jake. "Officer Miller regrets his actions deeply. He never intended to harm anyone. This was a tragic misunderstanding." The defense called Jake to the stand. As Jake spoke, his voice cracked, and his eyes darted nervously. I made a mistake," he admitted. "I wasn't thinking clearly that night. I've served this community for 8 years, and I've never done anything like this before." Linda's cross-examination, however, was relentless. "Mr. Miller," she began, her tone razor-sharp, "you claim this was a lapse in judgment, yet in the footage, we hear you say, 'You don't belong here.' Can you explain what you meant by that?" Jake hesitated, his mouth opening and closing before he finally muttered, "It was the alcohol talking." Linda's gaze didn't waver. "So you're saying the alcohol, not you, is responsible for pulling a gun on Mr. Lewis?" Jake squirmed in his... I wasn't thinking straight." "And yet, Mr. Miller," Linda pressed, "you were thinking clearly enough to bring your gun, to confront Mr. Lewis, and to make threats. That's not a lapse. That's a deliberate series of actions." Jake's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The trial concluded after several days of testimony. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all counts, including aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and abuse of authority. As the judge prepared to deliver the sentence, she addressed Jake directly. "Mr. Miller, as a police officer, you swore an oath to serve and protect. Instead, you used your position to intimidate and endanger. This court sentences you to 6 years in state prison. You will also forfeit your position as an officer of the law permanently." Jake's face paled, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the sentence settled on him. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering something, but Jake barely responded. After the trial, Mark stepped outside the courthouse, greeted by a crowd of reporters and activists. The flashing cameras and shouted questions didn't faze him. A journalist pushed forward, microphone in hand. "Mr. Lewis, do you feel justice was served today?" Mark paused before answering. Justice is about accountability. Today, Jake Miller was held accountable for his actions. But let's be clear, this isn't just about one officer. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter their position, is above the law. Mark Lewis had barely stepped onto his porch when he noticed a small group of neighbors gathering near his fence. It wasn't like before, no furtive glances or whispered conversations behind curtains. This time, they approached openly, with hesitant smiles and apologetic expressions. Leading the group was Karen Miller, a middle-aged woman who had once been among those who avoided eye contact with Mark entirely. "Mark," Karen began, her voice tentative, "we'd like to have a word if you don't mind." Mark folded his arms, leaning casually against the porch railing. "I'm listening," he said evenly, his tone neutral but not unkind. Karen glanced at the others before speaking again. "We owe you an apology," she said. "All of us do. When you moved here, we didn't make you feel welcome." "That's putting it mildly," Mark replied. His sharp tone softened slightly by the faintest hint of a smile. Karen nodded, clearly uncomfortable but determined to continue. "You're right. We let our assumptions and prejudices get the better of us. And when everything happened with Jake, we should have spoken up. We should have stood by you." Another neighbor, a man in his 50s named Alan, stepped forward. "To be honest, Mark, I wasn't sure about you when you first moved in. I thought you wouldn't fit in here." He hesitated, then sighed. "I see now how wrong I was. You didn't deserve what happened to you, and I regret not saying anything sooner." Mark studied the group, noting the mix of guilt and sincerity in their faces. "Why now?" he asked. "Why speak up after everything's already been settled?" Karen shifted uncomfortably, but it was Alan who answered. "Because watching what you went through made us realize how much we'd been ignoring. Not just about Jake, but about ourselves. This neighborhood isn't what it pretends to be, and we're part of the problem." The conversation grew more candid as other neighbors chimed in. One woman admitted she had let her fear of change cloud her judgment. Another man confessed that he had seen Jake's harassment and done nothing because he didn't want to get involved. "We let Jake get away with too much for too long," Karen said finally. "We thought it wasn't our place to say anything, but it was. And we're sorry." Mark took a long breath, letting their words settle. He had spent months feeling isolated in this community, convinced he was alone in his fight. Hearing their admissions didn't erase the past, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Karen reached into the basket she was holding and pulled out a small pot. "I know this doesn't fix anything, but I thought I'd bring something to say thank you for staying strong and not giving up. You've shown us what courage looks like." Mark accepted the pie with a faint smile. "Thank you," he said. "It's not about fixing the past. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again. If we're going to build something better, it starts here, with all of us." The conversation shifted toward solutions. Karen suggested organizing a neighborhood meeting to discuss inclusivity and accountability. Alan volunteered to help create a neighborhood watch program that focused on safety without bias. Mark listened carefully, offering his insights where he could. "It's not just about keeping people safe," he said. "It's about making everyone feel like they belong here. That's how you build trust." The group agreed, their initial hesitation replaced by a shared sense of purpose. As the neighbors began to disperse, Karen lingered for a moment, looking up at Mark. "You've been through so much and you still found a way to stand tall. That's something I admire, Mark. I hope we can do better by you and by anyone else who comes here." Mark nodded. "That's the goal. It's not just about me. It's about making sure this place is better for everyone." As Mark watched his neighbors walk away, he realized that even small steps could lead to meaningful change. The community wasn't perfect, but for the first time, it felt like progress was possible. The atmosphere in the precinct's conference room was tense. Officers sat with crossed arms and furrowed brows, their collective discomfort almost tangible. At the front of the room, Rick Daniels stood resolute, his gaze scanning the room. The fallout from Jake Miller's actions had shaken the department to its core, and Rick knew that superficial measures wouldn't cut. "Let me be clear," Rick began, his voice steady but firm. The events of the last few months have exposed cracks in this department. Cracks that we cannot afford to ignore. Change is not optional. It's necessary. Murmurs rippled through the room. One officer, a veteran named Davis, raised his hand. With all due respect, Chief, are you saying we're all being blamed for what Miller did? Most of us do our jobs right. Rick held his ground, nodding slightly. No, Davis. I'm saying that Miller's behavior didn't happen in isolation. It happened in an environment that allowed it to go unchecked. That's on all of us. The room fell silent, the weight of Rick's words sinking. Rick continued, his tone sharper. Starting next month, every officer in this department will participate in mandatory bias training. We'll partner with outside experts to conduct workshops on de-escalation, community engagement, and recognizing implicit bias. These sessions won't be a box to check, they'll be thorough, and they'll be continuous. More murmurs broke out, this time tinged with frustration. A younger officer, Patel, spoke up. Chief, I get the intent, but what if we don't need this training? Some of us aren't biased. Rick's eyes locked onto Patel's, his tone unyielding. Bias isn't always obvious, Patel. It's about the decisions you make without realizing why you're making them. And if you think you're immune, then you need this training more than anyone. The resistance grew louder as the meeting went on. A few officers openly questioned the necessity of the reforms, while others claimed the measures would undermine their authority in the field. Rick listened patiently, but made it clear there was no room for debate. Let me put it this way, Rick said, his voice cutting through the dissent. You have two options: commit to improving or find another department, because I won't tolerate anyone standing in the way of progress. The room went quiet again, the tension thick. Rick knew he was pushing against a tide of ingrained habits and beliefs, but he refused to back down. In the weeks that followed, the training sessions began. Instructors from civil rights organizations and de-escalation specialists led workshops that forced officers to confront uncomfortable truths. Exercises included reviewing body cam footage, analyzing scenarios where bias had influenced outcomes, and participating in role-playing situations designed to challenge their perspective. While some officers embraced the training, others resisted, their skepticism evident in their body language and half-hearted participation. Rick made it a point to attend sessions himself, setting an example and holding his officers accountable. During one session, an officer named Brooks stood up, his frustration evident. This is all well and good, but what about when we're out there, dealing with real threats? These lessons won't help us when someone's pulling a gun on us. The instructor, a former police chief named Lisa Carter, responded without missing a beat. No one's saying this replaces your training in the field, Officer Brooks. But if you're making decisions based on fear or bias instead of facts, you're putting yourself and the community at risk. Brooks sat down, clearly unconvinced, but Rick stepped. Brooks, I get it. This feels uncomfortable. But the goal isn't to make your job harder, it's to make it safer. For you and the people you serve. The results of the training didn't come overnight, but Rick began to notice subtle changes. Officers who had previously dismissed the reforms started asking more thoughtful questions during briefings. Reports of community complaints decreased, replaced by more positive interactions between residents and the police. Mark Lewis watched these developments from a distance. Rick had kept him updated on the department's progress, and while Mark remained cautious, he couldn't deny the small but meaningful shifts taking place. One afternoon, Rick called Mark to discuss the reforms. I'm not going to pretend we've fixed everything, Rick admitted, but I can promise you this, we're not stopping. The culture is changing, one step at a time. Mark appreciated Rick's honesty. It's a start, he said. Just make sure it doesn't lose momentum once the headlines fade. The changes within the department began to ripple outward, affecting the community as well. Rick organized town halls where residents could voice their concerns directly to the police. Mark attended one such meeting, where a young woman shared her experience of feeling targeted during a routine traffic stop. Rick listened intently before responding. I can't undo what happened to you, but I can promise you this. We're working to ensure that no one else feels the way you. After the meeting, Mark approached. You handled that well, he said. Rick gave a small nod. We've got a long way to go, but at least we're moving in the right direction. Mark Lewis stood at the podium, his voice steady as it carried across the packed auditorium. The room was filled with activists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who had come to hear him speak. His story had become a rallying point for conversations about equality and accountability in law enforcement. "The events I've faced are not unique," Mark began, his tone measured but resolute. "They're a symptom of a system that, for too long, has ignored the voices of those it's supposed to serve. Justice cannot stop at punishment. It must be about education, reform, and creating a foundation of trust." The audience erupted in applause, but Mark remained composed. This wasn't about applause or personal accolades. It was about momentum. After the talk, a young black woman approached him, her eyes filled with determination. "Mr. Lewis, your story gave me the courage to speak out. I've dealt with discrimination from law enforcement my entire life, but I never thought anyone would listen." Mark shook her hand firmly. "Your voice matters," he said, "and the more of us who speak out, the harder it becomes for anyone to ignore." As the evening progressed, Mark participated in a panel discussion. The questions ranged from practical reforms to deeply personal inquiries about his experience. Each time he answered with clarity, balancing his professional insights with the raw honesty of someone who had lived through the consequences of systemic failure. However, not everyone was supportive. A group of attendees, seated near the back, remained visibly unimpressed. During the Q&A session, one of them, a middle-aged man wearing a badge on his belt, stood and addressed Mark with thinly veiled hostility. "Mr. Lewis," the man began, his voice sharp, "don't you think you're exaggerating this whole situation? One officer made a mistake, and now you're painting an entire system as broken." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Mark. He met the man's gaze calmly, his expression unreal. "Exaggerating?" Mark repeated, his voice cool but firm. "Jake Miller didn't just make a mistake. He abused his authority, threatened my life, and shattered the trust between the police and the community. And let's be honest, he wasn't the first to do it, and he won't be the last if we don't address the root of the problem." The man frowned but said nothing, and Mark continued, "I'm not here to attack law enforcement. I'm here to hold it accountable, because accountability is what makes any system stronger. If you see that as an exaggeration, maybe you need to ask yourself why." A smattering of applause broke out, and the man sat back down, his expressions. Despite moments of tension like this, Mark's message resonated with many. His story began to attract attention beyond the local level. He was invited to speak at universities, participate in national forums, and consult with policymakers. Each opportunity became a platform to advocate for meaningful change. During one particularly high-profile event, Mark was seated alongside civil rights leaders and government officials. The moderator asked him directly, "Mr. Lewis, what's the most important lesson we can take from your experience?" Mark didn't hesitate. "That justice is a process, not a destination. It's not enough to hold one person accountable. We have to address the culture, the policies, and the biases that allowed them to act without fear of consequence." His words were met with a standing ovation, but Mark remained grounded. For every person who supported him, he knew there were others working to discredit him. The backlash became more visible as his profile grew. Anonymous emails accused him of attacking good cops or turning one bad night into a crusade. Social media posts labeled him a troublemaker, someone out to tarnish the reputation of law enforcement. Mark addressed these criticisms head-on during an interview. "I'm not anti-police," he said. "I'm anti-abuse of power. And if calling out injustice makes me a troublemaker, then so be it. Change doesn't come from staying quiet." One night after a particularly contentious panel, Mark was approached by a group of young activists. One of them, a college student named Amir, asked, "How do you keep going when so many people try to tear you down?" Mark thought for a moment before replying, "Because this fight isn't about me. It's about the people who come after us. If my story makes it a little easier for the next person to be heard, then every challenge is worth it." Mark's influence began to yield tangible results. Police departments in neighboring areas started implementing reforms inspired by the changes Rick Daniels had introduced. Community organizations reached out to collaborate on improving relationships between law enforcement and residents. During a meeting with policymakers, Mark emphasized the importance of action over rhetoric. "Reforms on paper mean nothing if they don't translate to real change on the ground," he said. "Communities need to see the difference, not just hear promise." Mark Lewis stepped outside onto his porch, a faint smile playing on his lips as the sound of laughter drifted from the park down the street. The neighborhood, once cold and distant, had changed in ways he hadn't thought possible. Children were playing on the swings, their joyful voices filling the air. Parents chatted nearby, exchanging warm greetings. It was a scene that felt almost foreign when he first moved here, but now it felt like home. The transformation hadn't come over. The weeks following Jake Miller's sentencing were tense, but they also became a turning point. The town's leaders, pushed by both public pressure and Mark's relentless advocacy, had taken meaningful steps to address long-standing issues. Neighborhood meetings became regular events where residents openly discussed concerns and worked together on solutions. Mark attended each one, sometimes to offer guidance, other times simply to listen. Karen, who had once avoided him, now led many of these gatherings, her newfound conviction inspiring others to take an active role. "I never thought I'd be the one organizing meetings like this," Karen admitted to Mark after one session, "but seeing how much you've done made me realize it was time for the rest of us to step." Mark nodded, his voice steady. "Change doesn't happen because of one person. It happens when people like you decide to make it happen." The police department, too, had begun to rebuild trust under Rick Daniels' leadership. Officers who resisted reform either adapted or left, and those who remained embraced the changes. The department's training programs expanded, focusing on de-escalation, bias awareness, and community engagement. Mark had been invited to speak to the officers during one of their training sessions. Standing before them, he didn't hold back. "Being a police officer is one of the hardest jobs out there," he told them, "but it's also one of the most important. When you wear that badge, you're not just enforcing laws, you're representing justice. And justice means treating every person with dignity, no matter who they are." The reception wasn't unanimous, but it was progress. Some officers approached him afterward, thanking him for his honesty. Others remained wary, but they listened, and for Mark, that was a... One afternoon, Rick stopped by Mark's house, his expression one of cautious optimism. "We've still got work to do," Rick said, leaning against the porch railing. "But I think we're moving in the right direction." Mark sipped his coffee, nodding. "It's not about getting everything right all at once. It's about making sure you don't stop trying." Rick hesitated, then extended his hand. "Thank you, Mark, for pushing us, even when we didn't want to be." Mark shook his hand firmly. "Keep pushing yourselves, Rick. That's what matters." The biggest change, however, came from the community itself. Neighbors who once stayed silent now spoke up when they saw injustice. Small acts of kindness became common: an invitation to coffee, a helping hand with groceries, or simply stopping to... One evening, Alan, the neighbor who had once doubted Mark's place in the neighborhood, knocked on his door. "Mark," he said, holding out a bottle of wine, "I just wanted to say thank you for not giving up on this place even when some of us didn't deserve." Mark accepted the bottle, a genuine smile crossing his face. "It's not about deserving, Alan. It's about believing people can change." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Mark sat on his porch, watching the golden light filter through the trees. Across the street, a young boy chased a soccer ball while his friends cheered him on. Their laughter echoed through the quiet street, a stark contrast to the tension that once lingered here. Mark leaned back in his chair, letting the moment wash over him. This was the peace he had fought for, not just for himself, but for everyone who called this neighborhood home. He knew the fight against injustice wasn't over. There were still barriers to break, systems to challenge, and minds to change. But for the first time, he felt hope, not the fleeting kind, but the steady, unwavering belief that progress was possible. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Mark closed his eyes for a moment, the sounds of the neighborhood filling the quiet. The journey had been long and arduous, but it had been worth it. Every step, every confrontation, every difficult conversation had led to this, a community that was finally starting to understand what it meant to stand together. And as the children's laughter carried on into the evening, Mark smiled to himself, knowing that the future he had dreamed of was no longer just a hope, it was becoming a reality. And so Mark's journey reminds us all that even the smallest actions can ignite meaningful change. His fight wasn't just about justice for himself, it was about creating a future where no one feels unwelcome in their own home, where communities unite to challenge prejudice, and where accountability becomes the standard, not the exception. What do you think it takes to build a truly inclusive and fair community? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit like, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this. Together, we can shine a light on the issues that matter most. See you next time.
The rain fell relentlessly on the sleepy streets of Silver Creek, a quiet town nestled in the rolling hills of Northern California. Water streamed down the windows of the small diners and shops that lined the main road, painting a hazy reflection of the neon open signs and puddles along the sidewalks. In the heart of this modest town, FBI Special Agent Marcus Bennett exited a nondescript sedan, his dark trench coat pulled tightly around his broad shoulders to shield himself from the downpour. Marcus, a tall, composed man in his early 40s, had just wrapped up a long surveillance operation targeting a money laundering ring connected to a local business. Despite his exhaustion, he walked with an air of confidence, one cultivated by years of facing high-pressure situations. His presence, however, was not met with the same confidence by others. Silver Creek was the kind of town where outsiders were immediately noticed, and a black man in a suit, even one as unassuming as Marcus, drew attention. As Marcus approached his car, he felt a gaze on him, a lingering, weighty suspicion that was all too familiar. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a patrol car idling a few feet away. Behind the wheel sat Officer Ethan Caldwell, a stocky man in his late 30s with closely cropped blonde hair and a jaw that seemed perpetually clenched. Ethan's face was as tense as his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes narrowing as he observed Marcus with visible skepticism. "Hey!" Ethan called out suddenly, stepping out of his cruiser. The door slammed behind him, and the sound echoed down the empty street. "You there? Stop right where you are." Marcus froze mid-step, instinctively raising his hands slightly to shoulder height, palms out. His FBI training kicked in immediately, telling him to de-escalate. But this wasn't new territory for him. Marcus had encountered men like Ethan before, men who carried prejudice as part of their uniform. "Yes, officer," Marcus said evenly, his voice calm despite the irritation bubbling beneath his surface. "What are you doing here?" Ethan demanded, his hand already resting on the butt of his holstered firearm. His tone carried the sharp edge of authority, mixed with something more sinister. Doubt, mistrust, and a simmering hostility. "You look out of place." Marcus arched an eyebrow, his lips tightening. "Out of place," he repeated, carefully choosing his words. "I'm parked here. That's all." Ethan took a step closer, his boots splashing in the shallow puddles forming on the pavement. "Let me see some ID," he barked. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of defiance, but because he knew where this was heading. He had lived through it before, being questioned for walking in the wrong neighborhood, being followed in stores, being doubted in spaces he had every right to occupy. Slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his leather badge case, flipping it open to reveal his FBI credentials. "I'm Special Agent Marcus Bennett," he said firmly, holding the badge out for Ethan to inspect. "I'm with the FBI. I've just finished an assignment in this area." Ethan's eyes flicked to the badge, his scowl deepening. He didn't even lean in to examine it. Instead, he snorted and shook his head. "That's fake," he said bluntly. Marcus blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said that's fake," Ethan repeated, louder this time. He took another step forward, his posture stiff and confrontational. "I don't know who you think you're fooling, but there's no way someone like you is an FBI agent." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "Someone like me?" he asked, his voice still measured but carrying a sharp undertone. "You heard me," Ethan shot back. "You're walking around here, dressed like that, flashing some fake badge, thinking I'm gonna let it slide? I don't think so. Hands on your head. Now." For a moment, Marcus didn't move. The absurdity of the situation struck him, but so did the weight of the implications. He could see the trembling in Ethan's hand as it hovered near his gun. He could hear the tension in his voice, the kind of tension that could escalate into something far worse if Marcus made the wrong move. "Officer Caldwell," Marcus said slowly, lowering his hands to his sides. "You're making a mistake. My badge is real. You can call the FBI field office in Sacramento to confirm my identity." "I don't need to call anyone," Ethan snapped. "What I need is for you to stop resisting and get on the ground before I make you." Marcus's jaw tightened. He stood his ground, unwilling to comply with the humiliating demand. "I'm not resisting," he said firmly. "I've identified myself. There's no reason for this." "No reason?" Ethan scoffed, his voice rising. "The reason is you're not supposed to be here. People around here don't take kindly to." "Ethan," a sharp voice cut through the tension, and both men turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, her smartphone held in front of her like a shield. Rachel McCarthy, a young journalist with fiery red hair and an equally fiery passion for uncovering the truth, was recording the entire exchange. "What the hell are you doing?" Rachel demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of outrage and fear. "He's done nothing wrong. You can't treat him like this." Ethan's face flushed with anger, and he pointed at her. "Stay out of this, Rachel. This has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," Rachel shot back, stepping closer. "And it has everything to do with this town. You can't just harass someone because you don't like the way they look." Ethan glared at her, but before he could respond, another car pulled up. A tall man in his late 50s stepped out, his salt and pepper hair and neatly trimmed beard lending him an air of authority. Detective Paul Grayson, the chief of the Silver Creek Police Department, approached quickly, his face a mask of concern. "What's going on here?" Grayson demanded, his eyes darting between Marcus, Ethan, and Rachel. Ethan immediately straightened up. "Sir, this man," Marcus interjected, his voice ringing with a quiet strength, "is an FBI agent. I've identified myself multiple times." Grayson's eyes flicked to the badge still in Marcus's hand. Recognition dawned on his face, followed by a deep, almost palpable regret. "Agent Bennett," he said, his tone shifting to one of respect. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were in town." "Realize?" Marcus repeated, his voice heavy with irony. "Your officer here accused me of being a fraud." He drew his weapon. Grayson turned to Ethan, his expression darkening. "Is this true?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His face was a mask of defiance and panic. The air around them felt as heavy as the rain that continued to fall in thick sheets, drumming against the asphalt. Officer Ethan Caldwell stood frozen, his jaw clenched tightly as Detective Paul Grayson's question hung in the air like an uninvited guest. "Is this true, Ethan?" Grayson repeated, his voice lower now, with an edge that carried authority. Ethan's face flushed deep red, but he didn't answer. Instead, his eyes darted to Marcus, then to Rachel, whose phone was still pointed in their direction, the screen capturing every word, every movement. "Sir, Ethan finally stammered, but Grayson raised a hand to silence him. "Don't!" Grayson snapped, his voice sharp. He turned to Marcus, his expression deeply apologetic, though his professionalism remained intact. "Agent Bennett, I'm truly sorry for this misunderstanding. I take full responsibility for—" "Don't apologize to me," Marcus interrupted, his tone calm but firm. "Apologize for the way your officer treated me. Apologize for the assumptions he made before I even said a word. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was something else entirely." Grayson flinched slightly, the weight of Marcus's words hitting him squarely. "You're right," he admitted after a long pause. "Ethan, hand over your badge and weapon. Now." "What?" Ethan's head jerked up, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Sir, you can't be serious." "I'm dead serious," Grayson replied coldly. "You've not only violated protocol, but you've disgraced this department. Hand them over." "This is ridiculous," Ethan hissed, though his hands moved reluctantly to unclip his badge and holster. He shoved them toward Grayson, his face twisting in anger. "You're throwing me under the bus because this guy—" "Careful," Marcus warned, his voice like steel. Ethan glared at him, but didn't finish the sentence. Grayson stepped between the two men, taking the badge and gun before turning back to Marcus. "Agent Bennett, I assure you, this incident will be addressed immediately. Ethan Caldwell is hereby suspended, effective immediately." Suspended. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. A suspension felt inadequate for what had just happened, for the humiliation and blatant prejudice he'd endured. But before he could respond, Rachel stepped closer. "Suspended?" she said, her voice dripping with incredulity. "You're suspending him?" "That's it." "Miss McCarthy," Grayson began, sighing as though he'd already anticipated her reaction. "This isn't a discussion for the middle of the street." "Then when is the discussion happening?" Rachel shot back, refusing to back down. "Because as far as I can see, the only reason this didn't escalate further is because Agent Bennett kept his composure. You're lucky no one got hurt tonight. How are you going to address that?" "Rachel," Marcus's voice was calm, but it carried enough weight to make her pause. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I appreciate your concern, but I'll handle this." Rachel hesitated, glancing between him and Grayson, before reluctantly nodding and lowering her phone. "Fine," she muttered, "but this isn't over." Grayson cleared his throat, shifting his focus back to Marcus. "If you're willing, I'd like you to come by the station tomorrow to file a formal complaint. We'll document everything." Marcus gave a short nod. "I'll be there." With that, Grayson gestured for Ethan to follow him back to the patrol car, but Ethan lingered, his eyes locked on Marcus with a venomous glare. "You think you're a hero?" he spat. "Walking around like you own the place." Grayson turned sharply. "Ethan, that's enough." Marcus didn't flinch. He stood tall, his expression calm and unwavering. "If standing up for myself makes me a hero in your eyes, maybe you should ask yourself why that bothers you so much." Ethan didn't respond. He simply turned and stormed off toward the patrol car, slamming the door behind him. Grayson gave Marcus one last apologetic look before following, leaving Marcus and Rachel standing alone in the rain. For a moment, there was only the sound of water splashing against the pavement and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. Then Rachel broke the silence. "You okay?" she asked, her tone softer now. Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "I've been through worse," he said, though his voice betrayed a weariness he couldn't quite hide. Rachel studied him for a moment, then gestured toward the small coffee shop down the street. "Come on," she said. "Let me buy you a coffee. Least I can do after all that." Marcus hesitated but ultimately nodded. "All right." Inside the cafe, the warm light and faint smell of freshly brewed coffee provided a stark contrast to the cold, damp street outside. Marcus and Rachel took a seat in the corner, away from the few other customers scattered throughout the space. Rachel set her phone on the table, the screen dark now, but the recording still fresh in her mind. "So," she began, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup. "What happens next?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from his own cup. "I'll file the complaint. From there, it's up to the department to decide how to handle it." "And you think they'll actually handle it?" Rachel asked, her tone skeptical. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but I've learned to pick my battles. Tonight was about getting out of that situation alive. Tomorrow is about accountability." Rachel nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I've lived here my whole life," she said after a moment. "I've seen guys like Ethan before. They don't just wake up one day and decide to be better. Someone has to force their hand." "Maybe," Marcus said, his voice quiet. "But it's not just about Ethan. This is bigger than him." Rachel tilted her head, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Marcus set his cup down and met her gaze. "Ethan didn't act the way he did because of some personal vendetta against me. He acted that way because he thought he could, because he thought no one would stop him. That's a systemic issue, not an individual one. Rachel leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. So, what are you going to do about it? I don't know yet, Marcus admitted, but I'll start by making sure what happened tonight doesn't get swept under the rug. Rachel studied him, then smiled faintly. You know, I think you're underestimating how much people will care about this story. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And why's that? Because, Rachel said, tapping her phone, people don't just care about the big picture. They care about the person standing in the middle of it. And tonight, that's you. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He simply sipped his coffee, his mind already turning over the events of the evening and the storm that was surely still to come. The following morning, the rain had eased to a light drizzle, but the storm brewing in Silver Creek was far from over. Marcus Bennett drove to the Silver Creek Police Department, his mind still replaying the events of the previous night. He wasn't a stranger to confrontations rooted in prejudice, but this one felt different, more public, more deliberate, and now it had the potential to ripple far beyond the confines of this quiet town. The small police station was buzzing with activity when Marcus stepped inside. Officers moved briskly through the narrow corridors, their conversations hushed but tense. As he approached the front desk, he noticed a few glances cast his way, some curious, others uncomfortable. "Agent Bennett," a voice called out. Marcus turned to see Detective Grayson, standing a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back and his expression professional but weary. "Detective," Marcus said with a polite nod. "Thank you for coming in," Grayson said, gesturing for Marcus to follow him. "Let's head to my office. I've already started drafting the report." The two men walked through the station, the hum of phones and chatter growing quieter as they reached Grayson's office. Inside, the room was modest but organized, with framed commendations lining the walls and a well-worn leather chair behind the desk. Grayson motioned for Marcus to sit, then closed the door behind him. "I won't waste your time," Grayson began, sitting down across from Marcus. "I've reviewed the footage from last night, and I've spoken to a few witnesses, including Miss McCarthy. There's no doubt in my mind that Officer Caldwell's actions were unjustifiable." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. "Unjustifiable is putting it lightly." Grayson winced but nodded. "You're right. I've already initiated an internal investigation, and I've notified the district attorney's office. Caldwell will face disciplinary action, and depending on how things progress, there may be grounds for criminal charges." Marcus studied Grayson carefully. The man seemed genuine, but Marcus had seen too many instances where internal investigations amounted to little more than lip service. "What about the rest of your department?" he asked. "Do you honestly think Caldwell's attitude is an isolated case?" Grayson hesitated, his gaze dropping to the desk. "I won't lie to you, Agent Bennett. We're a small-town department, and we've had our share of problems. But I've spent years trying to root out the bad actors and change the culture here. Caldwell, he slipped through the cracks." "Slipped through the cracks?" Marcus echoed, his voice sharp. "He didn't slip through anything, Detective. He was empowered by a system that allowed him to act without consequences. That doesn't happen in isolation." Grayson sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't disagree with you, but change takes time." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And how much time do you think people like Caldwell should get? How many more incidents like last night are acceptable while you wait for change?" Grayson didn't have an answer. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. A knock on the door interrupted the tension. Grayson called out, and an officer stepped inside, her expression cautious. "Detective, Miss McCarthy is here. She says it's urgent." Grayson glanced at Marcus, then back at the officer. "Send her in." Rachel McCarthy strode into the office, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her usual fiery confidence was tempered by a hint of nervous energy. She barely waited for the door to close before speaking. "The video's gone viral," she announced, looking directly at Marcus. Marcus's eyebrows lifted slightly, though his expression remained calm. "How viral?" Rachel handed him her phone, and he scrolled through the barrage of comments and shares. The video she'd taken the night before had spread across social media like wildfire, sparking outrage and heated debates. News outlets were already picking up the story, and hashtags like hashtag Silver Creek Incident and hashtag Justice for Marcus were trending. "I told you people would care," Rachel said, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. "This isn't just a local story anymore. It's national." Grayson rubbed his temples, clearly feeling the weight of the situation. "This is going to bring a lot of scrutiny down on the department," he muttered. "Good," Rachel shot back. "Maybe that's exactly what you need." Marcus handed the phone back to her, his expression thoughtful. "The attention is a double-edged sword," he said. "It could push for accountability, but it also means this town and your department are going to be under a microscope." Grayson nodded grimly. "I'll deal with it. My priority is making sure Caldwell is held accountable and that we prevent anything like this from happening again." Rachel crossed her arms. "And how do you plan to do that?" Before Grayson could answer, the door burst open and an officer rushed in, looking flustered. "Detective, we've got a situation," he said. "There's a group of protesters gathering outside the station. They're demanding answers." Grayson stood abruptly, his face tight with frustration. "How many?" "Enough to block the front entrance," the officer replied. "And it's growing." Marcus and Rachel exchanged a glance. "Looks like the microscope's already here," Marcus said dryly. Grayson exhaled heavily, then turned to Marcus. "Will you come with me? It might help if they hear from you directly." Marcus hesitated. He wasn't sure how he felt about being thrust into the spotlight like this, but he knew the stakes were bigger than his own discomfort. Finally, he nodded. "Let's go." The crowd outside the station was a mix of locals and activists who had driven in from nearby towns after seeing the video. They held signs with slogans like "Justice for Marcus" and "End Racial Profiling." The energy was electric, a mixture of anger and determination that seemed to ripple through the damp air. As Grayson and Marcus stepped outside, the crowd's murmurs turned into shouts. A woman at the front of the group called out, "Is that him? Is that the agent?" Marcus raised a hand, signaling for quiet. The crowd gradually fell silent, their eyes fixed on him. "I appreciate you all being here," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. "I understand your anger. I share it. What happened last night was unacceptable, not just for me, but for anyone who has ever faced discrimination or abuse of power. But this isn't just about me. It's about holding systems accountable and ensuring this kind of behavior is no longer tolerated." The crowd erupted into applause and cheers, but Marcus held up his hand again. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he continued. "And it doesn't happen because of one man or one protest. It happens when we hold people accountable individually and systemically, and when we demand better from those in power." Rachel, standing off to the side, recorded the speech on her phone, her expression unreadable. Grayson stood nearby, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of tension and respect. As Marcus finished speaking, the crowd began chanting, "Justice, justice, justice." For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to feel the weight of their support. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The real fight was still ahead. The atmosphere in Silver Creek was charged with a tension that refused to dissipate. Protests outside the police station swelled over the next few days, drawing people from neighboring towns and even larger cities. The incident involving Marcus had become a symbol, a rallying point for those who had long fought against systemic discrimination and abuse of power. Inside the station, however, the mood was markedly different. The small-town department struggled under the weight of the scrutiny. Officers shuffled through their shifts, glancing nervously at the protesters outside or at the growing stack of media inquiries piling up on the front desk. Morale was low, and Detective Grayson bore the brunt of it, juggling reporters, departmental oversight, and the fallout from Officer Caldwell's actions. Marcus, meanwhile, had opted to remain in Silver Creek longer than planned. He knew the FBI would eventually pull him back into active cases, but for now, his priority was ensuring the situation didn't get swept under the rug. He spent hours meeting with community leaders, activists, and even Rachel McCarthy, who had become something of a liaison between the protesters and the press. It was during one of these meetings, in a dimly lit church hall on the outskirts of town, that Marcus began to see the bigger picture. Around a folding table sat half a dozen local residents, each sharing their stories. "Caldwell isn't the first," said Maria Torres, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. "He's just the first one to get caught on camera. My son," her voice cracked, and she paused to compose herself. "My son was pulled over 3 times last month for no reason, just for driving home from work." A young man named Darnell nodded in agreement. "Same here. They always say it's a broken taillight or some nonsense. But really, they just see a black guy in a nice car, and suddenly it's a problem." Rachel, seated across from Marcus, scribbled furiously in her notebook. Marcus listened intently, his hands clasped tightly together. The stories painted a bleak picture of a department that had allowed men like Caldwell to operate unchecked for years. "Why hasn't anyone spoken up before?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but probing. Maria sighed. "We've tried. Complaints get ignored, or worse, they get turned back on us. You speak up, and suddenly you're the one under investigation." The words hung in the air, and Marcus felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about a culture, a system that perpetuated this behavior while silencing those who dared to challenge it. At the same time, in a cramped apartment on the edge of town, Ethan Caldwell sat alone at his kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey his only companion. The past few days had been a blur of humiliation and mounting consequences. His suspension had been made public, and the video of his confrontation with Marcus had spread like wildfire. The name Ethan Caldwell had become synonymous with racism and abuse of power. He hadn't left his apartment since that night. Every knock at the door made him flinch. Every notification on his phone, another reminder of the growing outrage. News anchors dissected his actions on national television, and former colleagues avoided him like the plague. But beneath the shame, there was still a smoldering ember of anger. In his mind, he'd been doing his job, protecting his town. And now, everything he'd worked for was crumbling because of a single encounter. As the whiskey burned down his throat, Ethan's thoughts grew darker. He couldn't shake the image of Marcus standing tall, defiant, even as he'd held him at gunpoint. The way the man had refused to back down, to submit. It infuriated him. "They'll move on," Ethan muttered to himself, his voice slurred. "People always do. This'll blow over, and they'll forget." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Back at the station, Grayson called a meeting with Marcus, Rachel, and a few trusted officers to discuss the department's next steps. The internal investigation into Caldwell had progressed rapidly, thanks to the overwhelming evidence against him. But Grayson knew that wasn't enough. "We need to address the root of the problem," Grayson said, pacing the small conference room. "Caldwell's not the only one who's abused his power. There are others. Officers who've ignored protocols, harassed civilians, or turned a blind eye when they should have spoken up." Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his eyes sharp. "Then you need to clean house. Identify the problem officers and hold them accountable. Anything less is just damage control." Grayson nodded grimly. "I agree, but that's not going to fix the culture overnight. This department needs systemic change, training, oversight, partnerships with the community. It's going to take time, and it's going to be painful." Rachel spoke up, her voice firm. "It'll also take transparency. The community needs to see that you're serious about this. No more closed-door investigations or vague press releases. If you want their trust, you have earned it." The room fell silent as everyone considered her words. Grayson finally nodded. "You're right. I'll hold a press conference tomorrow. Lay everything out, the investigation, the steps we're taking, all of it. And Caldwell, Marcus asked. The DA is reviewing the case, Grayson replied. There's enough evidence to charge him with misconduct and possibly more. Marcus sat back, his expression unreadable. Good, but don't stop there. If you really want to fix this, you need to keep going, no matter how uncomfortable it gets. Grayson met his gaze and nodded. I will. That evening, as Marcus prepared to return to his hotel, Rachel caught up with him in the parking lot. Hey, she called out, jogging to his side. Marcus turned, raising an eyebrow. What's up? Rachel hesitated, then said, I just wanted to say thanks for staying, for pushing for more than just a quick fix. Marcus gave her a small smile. I'm just doing what needs to be done. Yeah, well, not everyone would, Rachel replied. A lot of people would have walked away once the spotlight was on someone else. Marcus shrugged. Walking away doesn't change anything. Staying does. Rachel nodded, her expression thoughtful. You're right, and for what it's worth, I think people are starting to notice. Not just here, but everywhere. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He glanced out at the quiet streets of Silver Creek, the faint sound of rain tapping against the pavement. Let's hope it's enough, he said finally. As Rachel watched him walk away, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just a story. It was a turning point, and she was determined to see it through to the end. The days following the hearing in Silver Creek were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus's testimony had been aired nationwide, sparking heated debates in living rooms, newsrooms, and city halls across the country. The small, unassuming town had become the epicenter of a broader conversation about systemic racism in law enforcement. For the first time in years, Silver Creek wasn't just another dot on the map. It was a symbol of change. But for Marcus, the aftermath wasn't just about the national attention. It was about the personal connections he had made, the quiet moments of introspection, and the determination to ensure that what had started here would have lasting impact. 2 weeks after the hearing, Marcus stood outside the courthouse again, this time in the crisp morning air. The crowd that had gathered was smaller now, but no less passionate. Among them were community members, activists, and a few familiar faces, including Rachel McCarthy, camera in hand, ready to document the next chapter of Silver Creek's story. Detective Grayson approached Marcus with a cautious smile. You made an impression, he said, extending his hand. Marcus shook it, his grip firm. Let's hope it lasts. It will, Grayson said, his voice laced with conviction. Caldwell has officially been dismissed from the department, and the DA's office is moving forward with charges for misconduct and false reporting. That's a start, Marcus replied, his expression measured. But what about the department as a whole? What are you doing to make sure this doesn't happen again? Grayson hesitated, then nodded. We've brought in an independent oversight committee. They'll be conducting a full review of our policies and practices. It's not just about punishment anymore. It's about reform. Marcus studied him for a moment, then gave a curt nod. Good. Accountability is one thing. Prevention is another. Later that afternoon, Marcus met Rachel at the small cafe where they had first sat down together weeks ago. The place was quieter now, the bustle of reporters and onlookers having faded. You've been busy, Marcus said as he slid into the seat across from her. Rachel grinned, tapping her phone. You have no idea. The story's gotten bigger than I ever expected. People want to know what happens next. They're invested. And you? Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. What happens next for you? Rachel's smile faded slightly, replaced by a thoughtful expression. I've been thinking about that, she admitted. I started out wanting to tell the story of what happened to you. But now, I think there's a bigger story to tell. About this town, about the people who live here, about how we can move forward. Marcus nodded slowly. That's a story worth telling. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes bright with determination. "What about you? Are you heading back to Sacramento?" "For now," Marcus said. "But this isn't the kind of thing you walk away from. I'll be watching, and I'll be ready to step in if things start slipping." "Good," Rachel said with a small smile. "Because I think Silver Creek is going to need people like you, and not just from the outside." Marcus tilted his head, intrigued. "What are you getting at?" Rachel hesitated, then shrugged. "Maybe you're not done with this town yet. Maybe this town isn't done with you." In the weeks that followed, Silver Creek began to change. The Oversight Committee brought in new training programs and stricter policies for accountability. Officers were required to undergo bias training, and community members were invited to participate in discussions about policing practices. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't fast, but it was progress. As for Marcus, he returned to his work with the FBI, but the impact of Silver Creek stayed with him. He became a more vocal advocate for systemic change, speaking at conferences and participating in panels on racial equity in law enforcement. His story, while deeply personal, became a catalyst for something much larger. Rachel continued her work as a journalist, documenting the changes in Silver Creek and beyond. Her articles gained national recognition, shining a light on the town's efforts to rebuild trust and accountability. And though she and Marcus didn't speak often, they remained connected. Two people brought together by a moment of injustice, bound by a shared commitment to making things right. 1 year later, Marcus found himself back in Silver Creek, standing in the same spot where the confrontation with Ethan Caldwell had taken place. The street was quieter now, the rain long gone. A small group of children played in a nearby park, their laughter carried on the breeze. As he stood there, reflecting on everything that had happened, a voice broke through his thoughts. "Agent Bennett?" He turned to see a young black boy, no older than 10, looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. Behind him, a woman, presumably his mother, watched cautiously. "Yes," Marcus said, crouching slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "My mom said you're a hero," the boy said, his voice shy but sincere. Marcus smiled faintly, shaking his head. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone trying to do the right thing." The boy considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I want to do the right thing too." Marcus straightened, his heart swelling with a mix of hope and determination. "Then you're already on the right path," he said. As the boy and his mother walked away, Marcus felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, he truly believed that change was possible. Not just in Silver Creek, but everywhere. And as he turned to leave, he carried that belief with him, ready to face whatever came next.